Hey, welcome. I'm here with Dr. Rob Falconer, who's an associate professor of history at MacEwan University here in Edmonton. And we're here to talk about his research. So, Rob, thank you for joining us. Perhaps you could kind of give us a brief overview of your major research interests and then introduce us to the book that I believe you've just published.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. This is quite an exciting opportunity. When anyone hands you a microphone and says, talk about your research, it's great. So I became interested in social relations about 20 years ago when I was starting my PhD. And what fascinates me most, particularly in the early modern period, are the dynamics, just the dynamics between people who depend so heavily on each other, right, in these tight-knit communities. And so whether we're talking about communities or networks or social systems, it intrigues me. And so my early work on crime kind of explored that in one way. And my new work that looks at material culture, and particularly the material culture within a household, really kind of dives into the importance of the people around you, not just for facilitating, goods, but for the interactions, right? There's some great work being done currently in the field that really emphasizes that consuming is a social act, right? And so it kind of ties into that interest. And that leads me to, yes, thanks for mentioning it, a book that was recently published through the Scottish History Society and Boydell and Brewer publishers in the UK on the account book of John Clerk of Pennycook, a 17th century merchant who really lays the foundation for the kind of ascendance of his family. What makes Clark so intriguing, and I'll talk a bit about Clark in a moment, is that his son and his grandson, his great-grandson, go on to be these very prominent figures, not just in Scottish history, but in the UK in general. And often people will turn around and say, yeah, that original John Clark was a fascinating man, but let's move along to his progeny. And diving into his records made me just say this man needs to be explored, and not just him, but the social system around him.
Yeah, no, that's
So
wonderful. No, I mean, economic history, I think, can sometimes seem a little bit dry, but what you've done here is that you've rooted these economic changes and so on of the 17th century in a family and in personal life, which helps you connect it to society and culture and so on. Do you want to tell us a little bit about who John Clerk was and why are you interested in him, and what can his writings and what can his life tell us about some of the transformations of the late 17th century?
right. So John Clark's grandson in his diaries said that his family came from really humble beginnings, right? By this point, he's now Sir John Clark, the second baronet, and he's, rubbing shoulders with a lot of elite. And so he's kind of acknowledging the humble origins. So his grandfather, who sets the foundation, Pennycook, the kind of central figure in my book, his father was a merchant in Montrose, set his son, number of his sons up in apprenticeships with merchants. And in 1634, John Clark goes to Paris, where his natural skills in creating networks really enables him to amass quite a significant fortune. And in very short order, he's providing luxury goods and fine art to some of the most elite individuals in Scotland, in England, but also across kind of Western Europe. He's renowned for being one of the first to import Rembrandts, for example, into Scotland. So he's this art dealer and purveyor of luxury goods. And around 1645, he decides, to go back to Edinburgh. He's got about 10,000 pounds sterling in his pocket. But more importantly, he's got connections. And one of the things that really stands out about Clark is that he's adamant about face-to-face relationships. He wants to be front and center in all of his business transactions. And very quickly, he becomes an important moneylender to many of the elite who are caught up in the, what some call the crisis of the 17th century, right? But in Britain in particular, the War of the Three Kingdoms is causing many to lose their family fortunes. And so he kind of steps in and lends money. Now, the reason that Clark fascinates me, as I've already mentioned, is that, people who have looked at his descendants will kind of look backwards and say, this original merchant, he is the origin of the kind of eminence of this family line, and then they just move along, right? No one really says much more about him. Siobhan Talbot, a scholar in the UK, has done some work on Clark's time in Paris, but when he comes back and settles in Scotland, not much work is done after that, right? And again, getting back to my interest in social relations, I'm curious about how a relatively modest family all of a sudden become so prominent that not only are they lending money to the elite, but Clark's grandson is one of the commissioners for the union, right? So he's negotiating the union. His great grandson is a prominent naval tactician and writes these fantastic books about it. They're involved in architecture and music and just everything. So I thought it'd be interesting to kind of look at him. And then I dug into his records. And the one thing about Clark that everyone noted, from his contemporaries to the scholars who have mentioned him more recently, is that the man left prolific records. So it's not a case where, people wanted to write about him, but there wasn't any material to examine. It's massive, the records that he left behind. And, this account book that was just published, if you just quickly skim through it, you see these lists of all these disbursements, right? They spent this much on buying, milk and wheat and geese and whatever it is, right? But kind of interspersed between it all, he makes all these notes, right? So you'll get insights into the family, right? So he refers to his children as, my beloveds, and his wife, his most dear and beloved bedfellow. And so you get a kind of insight into his personality. And then for those who, either cross him or who he thinks aren't up to his standards, he has some other words that he uses to describe them. And so you get a really nice insight into them. Yeah. And so just from the scholar's perspective, this account book offers insights into a world that is, on the one hand, readily recognizable, right? I write lists, I keep track of all my disbursements and notes of what's going on in my family. So too did this man. But if you want to know anything about an up and coming landlord, you've got lots of information about landlord tenants in there. If you want to know about the craftsmen he's hiring to fix his home, the tailors he's hiring to outfit his family, the food that they're eating. If you're interested in diet, the man seems to be, I don't know if he was a bit of a hypochondriac or not, but the amount, he's got an entire account just for his medicines and apothecaries and doctors that are coming to visit. And it's quite massive. So there's just so much that you can take out of this book.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. It seems to me that one of the things that we do as historians is we uncover the difference and the otherness and the strangeness, the alterity of the past. But then we also want to show, how do things change and how do we get from the past to the present? And it seems to me that the late 17th century is very much a time of transition. It's the moment in which the early modern period becomes the modern period. It's a moment where things kind of become more familiar to us. So I guess, can you speak to that a little? I mean, are there elements of this man that are just sort of totally strange and weird to us? And then are there other elements that kind of seem familiar, seem like this man could live in the 21st century?
Well, I've been working and living with this individual for some time now that nothing seems odd, right? It all just seems so natural and normal. So I'll have to dig a little bit into that. I mean, obviously the diet, right? The amount of, and again, there's been some fantastic books in the last decade or so about, the gentry household, looking at things like gendered spending, right? So the amounts of money that are being spent on clothes versus the amounts of money being spent on like guns and books and musical instruments and that type of thing. So, just obviously, the individual social status is distinct from many of ours, right? So, what the disposable income is being spent on, although you could probably find some parallels there. The medicine is fascinating to me, right? Having these apothecaries out, essentially the household is responsible for bringing together all the items necessary for the various potions and concoctions and medicines and tonics and stuff, but the doctor's prescribing them, and that's quite interesting. That the leeches that are used. You mentioned the transition, and that it is fascinating. It's fascinating because increasingly when we dig in and we see the level of success of some of these families, and we see the transactions going on, we imagine that in crisis, life just shuts down. And maybe this is rather topical for us as we're going through the pandemic, right?
As is the chest of medicines.
Yeah, as is the chest of medicines, right? But the one thing is there is no slowdown, right? Illness, death. I mean, almost within the first few pages of the account book, we find out that Clark's first wife dies, and he's quite heartbroken about this. Same year, one of his daughters dies as well, right? And so all, from the burial to the testaments to the wills to all of that is captured in there, but also so too is the emotion. And yet between all that, he's still ordering the food that's necessary for the household. He's still taking care of his other children. He's still making sure that the tenants are, all of these things are going on. And so that's quite fascinating, right? Because it is that constant that life continues despite crisis, right? Despite the fact that, his father-in-law was essentially destroyed during the War of Three Kingdoms. He himself, Sir William Grey of Pintendrum, was quite a prominent merchant, but he, was on the wrong side for some people and ended up being imprisoned temporarily and losing a great fortune, right? And yet, the family continues to go along, right?
No, that's lovely. And, I think that's the other thing that history can do, is that it gives us a sense of perspective, and whatever the crises we deal with, our life continues and it carries on, just as John Clerk's life carried on in what was a very tumultuous century.
Absolutely.
Maybe, yeah. So maybe just in the time we have left, do you want to tell us a little bit about, because essentially what you've done is you've unearthed this source, this primary source, and you've reproduced it for students, for scholars here in Canada and in the Americas. As much as we'd all like to go to Scotland to look at the original, COVID makes that a little bit difficult. So I guess the question is, how do you hope that people will read this account? How do you hope that students and scholars will use it? What can they get out of it? And in the time remaining, if you want to tell us too, if you can see any kind of other spin-off projects that might arise from reading this account.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the nice thing about a printed primer like this is that it's accessible, right? So, you don't have to have the paleography skills to read 17th century Ham. Again, it's right in front of you. You don't have to make an appointment to get into the National Records of Scotland. And so students, as well as scholars, right, will be able to find it quite useful. I teach a senior level seminar on the household and material culture. And, this book will be fantastic to use, not as a text, but as a research tool for some of the students who are interested in looking at this, because they can actually dig into some primary stuff and then build it. I was mentioning all the different things that are able to be taken out of it, and one of the things that really stands out for me is the importance of Clark's kin. He really relies heavily on the family of his first wife, but his right-hand man, if you will, is his brother John Anderson, also a Clark, who's involved with him from the time Clark is apprenticed right up until his death. And Anderson goes about helping him take care of his children, facilitating things. And so the book that the monograph that I'm working on about Clark examines his life after he essentially retires, though he never really does, from being a merchant and a banker, and becomes the Laird of pennycook, right, a landlord, and establishes a social system. So we'll look at his kin and his relationship with tenants and his relationship with clients. And one of the people that jump out is John Anderson. So that's one of the kind of spin-off projects. Will be a monograph examining in more detail Clark's life between his retirement from trade and his death in 1674. When I was working on that, and I've been working on it for some time, but going through some of the records, I came across a record of a break-in to John Anderson's home, which was quite interesting. And in the end, a servant of John Clerk and a servant of John Anderson plotted to kill John Anderson and steal all his available goods. And sadly, they were successful. So Anderson is murdered and there's an inquest. The two servants are apprehended and eventually hung. And this just, for me, this was the perfect full circle because as you know, my early work was on crime. And so here, my new work looking at the household and social networks or whatever, kind of all ends with a major crime involving these individuals. And so it'll be fun to kind of, dig that out a bit. And will likely find its way into the other monograph I've been working on now a lot more slowly, and hopefully it'll eventually get done, on violence in early modern Scotland. My earlier work was primarily on petty crimes, but I'm intrigued by how violence is another way of examining these kind of social dynamics.
Yeah, well, it's amazing how things connect together and how one thing leads to another and then back again. So thank you, Dr. Falconer, so much for talking to us today. The book you've just published is called The General Account Book of John Clerk of Pennycook, 1663 to 1674. And we'll look forward to future monographs like Violence in Early Modern Scotland and Households, Global Exchange, and Scottish Politics. Thank you again for joining us.